Well, thank you for joining us. My name is Karen Corman, and I have the privilege of being the Executive Director of the UIC Alumni Association. Welcome to the UIC Alumni Exchange Series. Through our Alumni Exchange Series, we work to bring our alumni and friends a variety of programs and topics so you can explore, connect, and even escape from the everyday with a community of UIC alumni, faculty, and staff experts. You'll hear me say this a few times today, and I'll go ahead and put this in the chat here in a moment. But I encourage you to visit go.uic.edu/alumni exchange for the latest and greatest programming. And with that, I'm excited to start this program this afternoon as we are joined by School of Public Health Associate Professor of Environmental and Occupational Science, Dr. Michael Cailas. Dr. Cailas will discuss health impacts on industry emissions in Chicago neighborhoods and how community groups can rely on data to voice their concerns to influence the future. Thank you so much, Dr. Cailas, for being with us today. And I'll turn it to you to begin.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'll remove my face so I can focus on the presentation and the proper screen. Anyway, I mean, you're not missing anything because, as my students say, I have a radio face. So let me start with the presentation, okay? Which basically has as a focus environmental justice, okay? It's, and environmental justice occurs when communities and industrial polluters interact. I need, before starting, to mention that 3 UIC colleges are involved here. I'm sure you're familiar with the School of Public Health and the people from it that worked on this project. Then there's the Engineering College, and of course, Public Administration, which is a major component related to this work, okay? I would like to define environmental justice by going back in time, which is really not very proper, but you'll see why. During that era, the era of Industrial Revolution, there were no rules. There were no concepts of justice, environmental justice. And of course, as many people with a social sciences background, the overall justice had major problems. During that era, again, I mean, with history background, people with history background will totally recognize these codes and graphs. During that era, there was a rapid growth of almost everything. You had wages going up, you had industrial production as recorded with the blue line here on the graph, going rapidly up. And of course, you had overcrowding and pollution. It's interesting from a layman view to see how a great author describes this pollution. This pollution for us, the scientists, is basically the smog, the famous smog of London, okay? And Dickens describes it as black vomit, basically encircling and attacking everything. A very appropriate description. Why? Because during that era, and I'll keep on repeating that word, the medical establishment considered pollution as a miasma, as a disease, or it was known as well as a night air that brings basically diseases and eventually death. So the causes of this, I mean, obviously it's rapid growth, but rapid growth of what? You had emissions from coal-fired engines, operating mainly mills in cities like Manchester. The other thing that's not well documented are the chemical industries that appeared rapidly and basically were producing acids. Acids were really, really used for almost every application known during that era. And of course, the ones that know, acids have a very bad, characteristic when they are produced. They tend to create fumes, which are deadly. The other thing, of course, which was very common during that era was metal dust coming from the foundries, the many foundries around the industrial cities. Why? Because iron and metals were the basic new material used everywhere. Now, one thing you have to keep in mind is that this growth was totally unrestricted. There was no treatment or controls imposed, and in reality, they were not even known. So that created major problems. On top of that, you had overcrowding. Why? Because the agricultural system in Britain was falling apart. So everybody was rushing into the cities and, of course, living in slum areas because they were poor. Those slum areas did not have any public water supply. People had to rush to the so-called pumps of the city to get water, drinking water. Those were the lucky ones, because as you will see later on, there were others that were not that lucky to have a pump in their neighborhood. And of course, the big problem during that era, the overcrowding era and the no control, no justice, anything era, was waste disposal. The waste from houses and from industry were just disposed into the nearby rivers, untreated, no control for the quantity, just going there. A great scientist of that era, his name is Michael Faraday, I'm sure you're familiar with that name, wrote more or less a complaint letter to the editor of the London Times about the pollution of the Thames River. That letter was kind of prophetic. Why? Because a few years later, during the summer months, London, actually the entire London near the river, suffered from something which historically is known as the Great Stink. Why? The issue here is water quality, bad water quality related to organic waste, and high temperatures can create very, very unhealthy conditions. So here we get to define the first concept of environmental justice, which is the distributive component of it. So people, or a group of people, in this case immigrants, urban poor, and children, bear a totally disproportionate share of the negative environmental consequences in the slum areas they live. So that's a characteristic of that era that made a lot of people suffer, and of course the death rate was quite impressive. The other thing that I mentioned before is if you were not lucky to have a water pump in your neighborhood, you were just picking up water from the stinking river and drinking it. And that's documented by Dr. Snow, who did the first study about the origins of cholera in London. So this is the next to the river area, and we'll see what happened to it and what solutions some people gave. So let's go to the other concepts related to environmental justice. Most people during that era do not have the right to participate in policies related to the environment or their own health. Voting rights in Britain were given to all in the 1928 era. Until then, they were always finding ways to prevent working people, disadvantaged people from voting. And the Brits were very good at that. The other thing that we're starting to conceptualize is that the identities of people like children and Irish immigrants, which were a big part of this working class, were totally disrespected. They were not valued. They were just considered as labor, and labor probably during that era didn't have any relevance to humanity. You can see here in this nice image of that era, children under 10 working in mills. The first study that came and started to analyze the situation in the slums and the consequences of growth was by Friedrich Engels, 1845, in his famous book, The Condition of the Working Class in England. That study basically found that there are major issues, pollution issues, appearing in the quarters of working people. And not only she documented it with numbers, she as well started showing how disadvantaged these people were compared to the average population. Another great person of that era was Dr. Snow and his famous study about cholera. Here, I guess you get in numbers, a very nice picture of that era. Why? You see that the east and south part of London, which is where the slums are, they're not anymore, they were heavily devastated by a very, very high death rate when the cholera epidemic showed up, okay? And unfortunately, it kept on showing up during that century. So the threat here is that you have a city, segregated city. Why? Because, well, the well-off people, like the ones living in Buckingham Palace, are living in the west, northwest. Pollution is really small. I'm sure they had access to very good water supplies. Wastewater was not treated, but there were things to do that took care of the problem. The big problem was the disadvantaged people that were living in the east and the south, far away from the well-off areas, separated by a river, actually. And those people were really suffering. As you can see it here, in the case of the South, the death rate is extremely high compared to, let's say, the West. The other thing that's starting to appear during that era is something called slumming. That word has been used in Chicago as well, and later on I'll show you where you can find information about that activity of well-to-be people. And that activity involved getting a good escort, a very tough-looking escort, and visiting the neighborhoods that people were living in and, of course, suffering. It was a trend of that era. The opinions are, both ways. One interesting thing of that so-called slumming, which looks like a tourist activity, is that it raised awareness of the conditions, especially conditions of kids, conditions of mothers, okay, in those slum areas of the east and the south. Now let's go back to the famous street that Dr. Snow was mentioning in London. And here we'll see the first, incidents of a procedural policy in justice. Why? In the name of public health, that whole section of the city where people, working class people were living, was totally demolished. And sewer lines, collection sewer lines, and preventive walls were implemented. That was a great solution, and the main reason this program was implemented in that neighborhood is just across from that, southeast part of London is the Parliament. It's just across the river. This neighborhood is just across the river, and of course, the honorable lords did not do very well, with the stinking river just in front of them. So now, with this brief introduction, and review of some historical events and facts, we can start defining what environmental justice principle and concepts are. So one thing we have to keep in mind is that in order to have issues related to environmental justice, you need hazardous sources, degrading quality, of course, disadvantaged people living near those sources, and unrestrained land use. The last one actually carries over centuries later, as we will see in the Chicago case that we will examine, okay? The other, let's say, major concepts related to environmental justice, which are officially used now by EPA and other environmental agencies throughout the globe, is the distributive component, as we call it, of justice, the procedural, and the policy and recognition. We'll go back to these components later on and try to define them better. Before going to the era, our era, or the beginning of the environmental justice movement in the States, it's very, I really feel obliged to present this great work that the Department of History has done. Okay, it's a great site that gives you an idea of the living conditions. They call it the human documentary. So it gives you a great idea of the living conditions in the slums of Chicago during the 1890s to 1930 era. As you can see from the pictures and the very happy faces, okay, this was not a very happy area to be in. So let's go now to the beginning of the environmental justice, the proper beginning of the environmental justice era, okay, which basically starts with the civil rights movement in the States. Chicago, as usual, was one of the first cities actually to get involved and recognize the issues inflicting communities of color. And they were focusing on lead poisoning in the underprivileged neighborhoods of Chicago. Of course, I'm not going to go through the various acts that were implemented then. It just shows you the time lag between events and basically the official establishment responding to these events. So years later, racial discrimination related to environmental quality was recognized and officially entered, the government circles. During that era, the beginning, everybody was focused on the so-called distributive justice aspect of environmental justice. Again, you have the RCRA, very important act that basically started managing hazardous waste. And the reason they were doing it, you had cases like the Love Canal and the Valley of the Drums, totally destroying the environment in nearby communities. One thing we have to point out here is that during that era, people started challenging the siting of hazardous waste sites. And this one, Bean versus Southwestern Waste Management, is a historical, let's say, challenge. Why? Because basically a waste disposal facility was going to be sited next to a community of color in Houston. Unfortunately, the permit was given. Why? Because a major obstacle for communities to overcome during that era was the intentional discrimination clause, let's say, restriction that the judges were asking them to provide, okay? And in order to do that, we're talking about poor communities now with, volunteers, usually lawyers. They did not have access to data and information. So the two famous cases that I'm going to be quoting here are the ones I know. There are a few others, but at least the ones I'm familiar with, both of them failed. Why? Because there was no intentional discrimination proven by the communities. The 82 incidents in North Carolina is a famous incident involving PCBs, contaminated soil that was going to be dumped in a landfill next to a community of color. It created a major uprising in that community. A lot of actually activists all over the states went there to express their disapproval. And the main reason was PCBs were highly toxic, known carcinogens that were officially banned in '79. So suddenly you were disposing PCB contaminated soil in next to a community of color. That's where a lot of leaders and names like Ben Chavez gained prominence, okay, and of course contributed in establishing this movement that we'll see later on how it evolved. So back to the need of data and visualizations, an agency not related to the environment, the General Accounting Office, published the first, let's say, a study which found that the waste landfills of that era, the hazardous waste landfills, okay, were located near communities of color. This is significant. Why? Because the hazardous waste landfills are not landfills where you dispose of residential garbage. This is highly toxic industrial-based waste, and of course, 3 of the 4 landfills that the GAO study found were located in communities of color. 87 is a landmark year. Why? Because the United Church of Christ Commission for Racial Justice with Ben Chavez and Charles Lee, a name we'll see again later on, basically published a document that clearly makes the case of an unequal distribution of waste sites in the US. And these, again, I keep on repeating it, these are not facilities emitting pollutants. These are highly toxic waste sites, landfills. And these landfills, as the study found, were very close to communities of color. The era that followed was significant. Why? Because suddenly people understand the racial dimension of the problem. It was obvious that there was an unjust distribution of sources. And the most important thing was that, the siting of LULUs, as they used to call them, okay, locally unwanted land uses, okay, was heavily influenced by white middle-class people that did not want in their backyards anything related to pollution. So as you can see here, and there are a lot of publications discussing the issue, okay, you basically had forms of structural racism going on. Why? Because the disadvantaged people were unable to intervene in the decision process. Of course, if the disadvantaged people went to courts, there was not a lot of supporting evidence for their case. And the other thing you have to keep in mind with the environment.
You did register me?
Yeah, in person.
Where? Yeah.
So sorry, there's an interruption here. Sorry.
Yeah.
Well, let me continue. So the other thing you have to keep in mind is the scale of the environmental justice issues. Okay, it's local. It's not global, it's not national, it's not statewide, it's local. Local communities, communities of color are the ones bearing the burden. Oops, sorry. Well, this was the most probably significant event in the history of environmental justice movement, the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit in Washington. They then defined the principles of environmental justice, which are still applicable these days. I'm highlighting a few words that you are all familiar with, okay? And there's no need to repeat. So I can save some time and answer questions, I hope. 92, the first Environmental Justice Act. And what followed in 94 was the famous executive order, it's known as Executive Order 12898. Why? Because it establishes, environmental justice as something that federal agencies need to account for in their decisions. And we'll see in the definitions that were coming out from that executive order. The other thing you have to keep in mind is environmental races, class issues, distribution, unequal distribution of risks became prominent in academic publications. Of course, you had a series of acts. Some of them, one actually underlying cumulative impacts was never implemented. But it shows how the movement managed to change the regulatory landscape. And then a year ago or so, the Executive Order 14008, it will be known, came. And this totally changed the landscape of environmental justice. It's not well known. It's still kind of discussed, but this new executive order will have major implications. Why? It starts looking at communities the way they are, not the way academics like us like to see them. These communities are overburdened, and they're not facing one or two threats from hazardous sources. They're facing multiple threats that become even more significant because of their poor status, socioeconomic status. Okay, which kind of exacerbates all the the negative impacts from environmental considerations. Questions, please, if there are any.
I haven't seen any come through the chat yet.
Okay. Okay, I'll continue then. And then, as we said, if you have any questions, feel free to email them to me or email them to the organizers, okay? And I'll be more than happy to answer them, okay?
Feel free to use the chat right now, and we'll ask you.
Okay. So after this definition section, okay, and a small historical overview, let's go to the definitions that are used now. Okay, so you have the prerequisite. It's very important to keep in mind the word proximity here. We're going to be using it, and this is the let's say the major prerequisite. You need a disadvantaged population, and you need hazardous sources to be nearby in order to have environmental justice issues. So in terms of definition, as we said, we have the distributive fair treatment component of environmental justice, which is officially used now in the regulations. The other component is the procedural, which means meaningful involvement, which means people being able to participate and influence decisions, something unknown before, even in the 60s and 70s and 80s, as you saw before, okay? The third component that's kind of embedded in the other two, but it's very well defined in UK. I guess they went through a lot of issues there, as you saw. and in the and adopted by the EU, the European Union, is the policy and recognition component of environmental justice. That's important. Why? Because it brings in the forefront the need to respect identities of people, unique identities of people, take them into account when it comes to implementing policies. Okay, as you saw before, especially in Europe, there were whole areas totally demolished. Why? Because the example in France is the boulevards of Paris wanted to be built, so they sent in the army to basically get rid of the people that were living there and create those wonderful boulevards that tourists like to walk. So this is a significant as a characteristic of the environmental justice components we're talking about, and it is embedded in the other two that the EPA is using as well, but not clearly. Okay. The other thing I want to point out is the so-called visualization tools, and that's what we're going to be talking about. These tools, as Charles Lee wrote a year and a half ago, he's the author of the 87 report that started everything, okay, are very important. Why? Because it helps communities and policymakers identify solutions. It helps actually people not living in those communities understand, visualize the unfairly impact that these risks have on communities of color. The other thing, of course, is that with these tools, and we have one to show, you can engage stakeholders, okay, community people, policymakers, even the industry, and seek just solutions for the problems. So I'll go fast through them. Two very important tools for doing this kind of work is the Cal Enviro screen, started in the early 2000s. A very, very useful screen for California, though. The other one that a lot of people in this crowd are familiar with is the EJ screen, okay? This is a real great tool. We use it as well. We teach it to our students. And the nice thing about this tool is it provides all the information you want at a national level, and it provides as well measures of proximity. How close to the site you're interested in are the polluting sources? So keep those two in mind. And a few months ago, UIC came up with a visualization tool. It's kind of different from the other two. It's kind of different from the environmental justice screen of the EPA. Why? Because it's focusing in Chicago. And the information we have is basically information that we collected from local community groups. And I've seen on the list a few community members here, so you can ask them. One thing we included are the asphalt plants, a known problem for the Southwest Chicago communities. And something we're working right now is to include community locations of interest. These are facilities that the community thinks it is a problem for them. The other things that are in this dashboard interface are the TRI facilities. TRI facilities are toxic release inventory facilities. Those are facilities that are obliged by law to report to the EPA what they emit every year. Brownfields, those are sites that cannot be developed because the soil is contaminated. Chicago has quite a few of them. Rail yards, which is a characteristic of the Southwest, and I don't know if we're going to have time to discuss about it, but that's another focus of our work. Industrial roads, we did not include them in the in this dashboard, but again, we have them in the studies that we made public. And something that we are starting to, we're not starting, we're trying to quantify is something called landscape burden. And I'll explain you what that means with the appropriate maps. Let's go to the, oh, sorry, I forgot. The other thing that our dashboard has is it's focusing on schools. Why schools, especially public schools, have children, young children that stay there for a long period of their life. And as everybody knows, they're very sensitive to pollution, okay? So that's why we included the school information in our dashboard. For Chicago, since we're talking about Chicago and we're going to be focusing, these are the characteristics of the public Chicago schools. As you can see, almost half, okay, this blue thing up here, almost half of the student population is Latino. And that is something significant, significant in terms of testing for us. So if we want to do statistical tests, these two, let's say, segments of the population are quite valid. The other thing you have to realize is that the people that go to the Chicago public schools are almost 80% low-income people. And that means a lot of things for people that know about public health and social policies, okay? Again, back in our Chicago, the other thing we found is that Chicago students in K-8 schools are very closely associated with the distribution of the overall Latinx population. So basically, by studying the Latinx student population, you can have a relatively good picture of what's going on in the community as well. So let's see in a very simple way the burden concept that we are using, okay? Burden is simple, a very simple concept used for many, many years, okay? So we did not invent it. And it basically accounts for the sensitive population, in this case, the schools, and the toxic, let's say, sources of hazards. So it's simply a simple way of figuring out a burden is multiplying the number of students to the number of, let's say, facilities, toxic facilities in a radius, in a specific radius related to the proximity you want to study. This is slightly more complicated, but more or less it says the same story. One thing you have to keep in mind is we calculate the burden for each school. Now, that's very useful if you're interested in an individual school, but usually communities want to find out what's going on in their communities. So what we've done is we aggregated the information, okay, and we call it collective proximity burden, which is basically a sum up of the burden of each school in the community area we're interested in. And Chicago has 77 community areas, so each one in the next graph is represented. As you can see here, and this basically gives you an idea of what's going on. When it comes to TRI facilities, the toxic release inventory facilities of Chicago, the majority of the burden is shared by these communities out there. Okay, worth noting are these three communities which are above 2 times the standard deviation. Now, standard deviation is just a measure, a threshold that gives you an idea of how spread the distribution is. So anything above 2 standard deviations is an extreme value. And here you can see that one community that we'll find out which one we're talking about is 4 times above the standard deviation in terms of burden. So here are the communities, and surprise, surprise, all of them are in the Southwest. Why? We'll kind of discuss the issue. Okay, so these 3 communities are heavily burdened by TRI facilities. Okay, now burden doesn't mean risk. Keep that in mind. However, environmental justice doesn't mean individual risk. It means the distribution of burden. So these communities, compared to the others, We even remove the zero so we can make a nice graph. So these communities, actually even these ones, are bearing a burden that's way above any average you can think of. Just to give you an idea, the average is here, okay? And these communities are way out there. So in terms of the environmental justice principles that we, presented before, these communities are way out. They have very significant issues, okay, to deal with in terms of burden. This gives you a better picture, not a graph, but the community areas involved. As you can see, the blue dots, the blue circles are the percent of students, Latinx students in the schools, all the schools in that community. And of course, the coloration, this is high, this is medium high, and this is low. The coloration is more or less what we're talking about before in terms of the communities and their burden. Again, this is TRI burden and 1 mile proximity. Any questions?
Yes. Thank you.
Nice. Very good.
Wonderful. A question has come in. Do you think the EPA will revoke the permits of polluters next to disadvantaged communities going forward?
I'll answer that question in the next presentation because we're doing a case study exactly on that. And at least we can describe what has to happen in order for let's say, a permit not to be issued. And it's not the EPA that does that. You have to realize in terms of permit regulations, it's usually the state agency or the city that issues permits, not the EPA. The federal EPA does not get involved. It might have an opinion though, and in some cases, like in the Southeast metal shredder facility, they contributed greatly. Okay, but again, the main burden for a permit decision is at an IEPA level, a state environmental protection agency, and the city level.
Okay. Great. Well, so then maybe if you want to go to the next section, just to make sure we have enough time for additional questions.
Okay, let me go to the next. Yeah, and actually we'll cover this issue in this section. Okay, so let's go back to what we were talking about. Why? Because permits, and it's a very interesting question, a very good question actually. Permits until now are issued based on individual facilities that are proposed. Now, if you think about that, that's okay. You do a risk assessment, you do measurements, and then you say, well, this facility is fine. I mean, it doesn't emit that much pollution, okay? Well, the problem is not the individual facility. The problem now is what happens if around that individual facility you have 7, 8, 9 more, you have 2 or 3 schools, and the other problem, of course, is you have the well-known socioeconomic stressors. The community is disadvantaged, doesn't have the best access to healthcare, and so on and so forth. A story that everybody of us knows about these communities. So this brings us to the objective of our dashboard. What we focus on is, first of all, to show where the sensitive populations are. Okay, that's why we have the schools in our dashboard and information. If you click on the dots that represent the schools, you'll find all the information you want about them. The other thing is we want to be able to visualize multiple factors that impact the communities. Why? We want to show to the community and the policymakers that their surroundings are overburdened, or they're not, okay, depending on the area. And again, the other thing we want to do is comparisons. So, for example, we want to compare the southwest side with the northeast, where a lot of people live, okay? Especially a lot of people from the, from at least my college that I know of, okay? So just give you an idea of the Southwest. These are the demographics. As you can see, they don't fare, they're not as close as the average, of Chicago in terms of race and, of course, income. Okay. Here, I'm going slightly fast because I want to answer questions. Here, you can see what we're talking about before, which is the landscape burden, something that's not accounted in decision making yet. We're hoping to introduce it. Why? Because if you live next to a legacy industrial zone, these zones were created a long time ago. Okay. 70s or 80s, some of them, you're talking about a burden, okay? And here in the Southwest, you have something unique. The residential sector is surrounded by the industrial zones. So this is something we call landscape burden, something no regulations right now is quantifying, trying to quantify or take into account. Here you can see another issue, which is the official word for industry, heavy industry usually. They call it planned manufacturing district. Each city has a different name for it. PMD is the one that the Chicago previous administration was using. As you can see here, the cities, the communities, we're talking about this, and that. If you add up the space they have in terms of facilities, it's almost 50% of the entire PMD of Chicago. So half of the PMDs of Chicago are located in this neighborhood, and that's significant. Okay, this is where you can find the information, the map, and how to use it. And we'll focus on the question that was raised before. And this quote is not something that we wrote, okay? This is a quote from the EPA, the new strategic plan that they have. And this is the federal EPA. So eventually it will trickle down to the state agencies and hopefully to the city. So the big problem is that EPA realized that it's easier to site an 8th facility in a community that already has 7. And that's the case with these 3 communities, okay? That's why you have the overburden. It was always easier to just dump facilities down there. For us, in academia and not living in that area, it's very important to get feedback from the community. As we said, a lot of the facilities we identified are based on community input, and we'll show them in our maps. This is the entrance to the interface. We won't have time to go in, but here is one, let's say, assessment that the community and the alderman, the local alderman, asked us to do. It involves a new facility that's being proposed to be placed here in this community. Okay, and the problem, as you can see, is what happens if an 8th facility has to be sited in such a community like this one. It's between Pilsen and Little Village. This is a closer view of what's in that facility. Around this facility. You can see these blue dots are schools. So you have 7 schools. These pink circles are TRI facilities. The yellow ones are brownfields. You more or less have everything. And of course, the asphalt plants with green. So this is the assessment, if I can say. So you have about 3,300 children, very young children being nearby, 1 asphalt plant, 1 brownfield, 7 TRI facilities, and of course the landscape burden. And here you can see it. Why? Well, this residential area of a few blocks, maybe close to 10 in the biggest, let's say, dimension. So this residential area is sandwiched between 2 industrial zones. That is significant. Why? These industrial zones need traffic, heavy truck traffic to be serviced. Trucks come and go every day, carrying goods and moving away goods. The other thing you have to keep in mind is this thing here, which is a rail yard. So on top of having everything else, you have a rail yard just outside the 1 mile distance radius. The approach we're proposing is okay, you have a facility, but instead of focusing on the facility, let's focus on what's around the schools that are nearby that facility. Here you can see for that specific facility I mentioned before, the distance is about 1,500 feet. That's like a 5 minutes walk, a straight line walk, okay? Heavy, I can say almost 100% Hispanic students in that school, and the majority, the vast majority is low-income students. So what's around that school? You can see it here. This school.
Oh, I'm sorry,
Yeah,
Dr. Cailas. I'm so sorry to interrupt you. I just wanted to give you a quick time check that we have about 5 minutes left, and I hate to.
I thought 10
interrupt
minutes,
you.
but it's okay.
So much good information, so I'm sorry about that.
So I'm almost finished. Yeah, that's why I rushed a bit. So around the school, you have 5 TRI reporting facilities emitting 16 toxic chemicals, 1 rail yard, 1 asphalt plant, and 1 brownfield. And on top of that, you have the landscape burden. That's what's going on in that part of the city, and it's kind of interesting. Why? Because there's no mention here, and we did that on purpose, of risk. What we're saying is when you're looking into environmental justice, risk is not an issue. The equity is. Why? Because, why this school should be totally different, exposed from this one, which is somewhere in the northeast, okay? Now, you might say that it's exposed to 2 cemeteries, but, cemeteries are not, they don't emit anything, at least that I know of. As you can see here, and it's very common, okay? 0 TRIs, 0 rail yards, 0 brownfields, okay? I'm sure there's some small facilities here and there, like gas stations, but that's all around the area. The other thing you have to realize is, that's why I picked up this area, is this industrial corridor is being moved to the south of Chicago, southwest or southeast, we don't know. So this is the end of my presentation. Any questions? I did it on time, so.
No, you're wonderful. Oh, Dr. Cailas, you're wonderful. Thank you for all of this information.
Well, please ask questions, though. I mean, I didn't do all this work to go away without any questions.
Well, I definitely have a question that's coming for you, and then I'm going to also, if you are comfortable, and I think you said before, we could share your email address if people.
Yeah, please do. Please do.
But we did have a question come in that was, how do you calculate the median or appropriate amount of environmental burden? Or to put it another way, if everyone has equally breathable air, is that environmental justice?
Equally breathable air. Well, there's a lot of issues here. One issue is, children don't breathe the same amount of air as adults. So that's one thing to consider. And let me go back to the formula, which gives you kind of an idea. Okay, here. The way you make the scale of burden relative is to include the percent of the sensitive population. So here, each school is kind of weighted based on how many students they have in terms of the overall student population. So that kind of gives the relative scale. Can you repeat the question, please?
Sure, give me just 1 second. Okay, how do you calculate the median or appropriate amount of environmental burden? To put it.
So median, okay, I got it. So median is not. So probably they're referring to this figure. There's no median. We don't like to use the median. Why? Well, the environmental justice principle, especially the distributive just component of it assumes a normal distribution. The burden should be normally distributed under ideal conditions. You can say that it might be skewed, okay, but when we're talking about a skewed distribution, that distribution should never go above 2 standard deviations. Median is a better measurement, that's the better statistical measurement, but here we want to make a comparison of what the mean is, which under ideal conditions is here. And maybe these communities we're talking about are here, okay? But they're not 2 times above the standard deviation, and definitely they're not 4 times above the standard deviation. I hope this answers the question. I can provide more details how we calculated the burden in an email if the person that posed the question is interested.
Well, thank you, Dr. Cailas, and thank you for all this incredible information in your presentation. We're so grateful you're on faculty and so knowledgeable. We will go ahead and put your email in the chat if you are comfortable again with that.
Yes, please do. Yeah, please do. Yeah, no
Wonderful.
Problem at all. Okay, and I'll try to answer, within a day or so. Okay.
Yes, of course. No, but thank you so much, and thank you for this wonderful presentation. I will remind everybody that we are recording the session, so if you want to go back and look at the slides, I encourage you to do that because there's so much great data and just work.
Well, before finishing, I want to thank as well the communities and the wonderful people of the Southwest that brought us into this project. Okay, I have to keep on repeating this. We did not think of this project. The community basically told us their problem and we started looking into them. Okay, we were not aware, though they're next door neighbors, of these enormous problems they're facing. Okay, and as I keep on repeating, this is an ongoing project. We just think we're starting. Okay, and there are many more problems ahead of us. Okay, thank you so much.
No, well, thank you, Dr. Cailas, for this wonderful presentation. And I will also add thanks to our community partners and just so grateful for all of your wonderful work. Just quickly to close this out, I encourage everybody to please join us for our next Alumni Exchange program on Wednesday, March 30th at noon Central Time for a special Alumni Exchange program that you won't want to miss. Each day we watch each day we watch the ongoing developments as Russia continues its invasion of Ukraine. We will be joined by an associate professor of political science in the College of Liberal Arts, Dr. Kosta Donina, who will establish the war's geographic and recent historical and political context and discuss Ukraine's democratic trajectory and European aspirations as she presents Putin's War, Ukraine, Russia, and the West. To find a recording of this episode and all of our past episodes, please go to go.uic.edu/alumni exchange. And of course, please be on the lookout for that brief survey that I mentioned. We went ahead and put your email in the chat. And again, Dr. Cailas, thank you so much for this incredible work and all of your time today. We're so grateful again for you and for being on faculty and just all the wonderful work you're doing at UIC. And thank you to all of you for joining us for this Alumni Exchange program. We hope to see you at a future Alumni Exchange program. Thanks again and have a great rest of your day.